Candace Owens is white people's diversity hire. So when she goes on those platforms, she's only being welcomed to these black platforms is because she's black, right? So she's not saying anything new or interesting. The conversations are not new or interesting. It's just for clickbait, and I wish that black media wouldn't do it because her ultimate goal, or the goal of the people who use Candace Owens, is against everything that black people have worked for.
And that is many ways the premise of my book, The Grift, The
Yes.
Downward Spiral, Black Republicans from the Party of Lincoln to the Cult of Trump. And one of the things that and this is so fascinating, I want you to break it down, Jason, is that in the 19th century, you had black media going hard on Booker T. Washington. Ida B. Wells was dragging Booker T. Washington to filth for his famous Atlanta Compromise speech. We're talking about the 19th century here. There's no radio. There's no social media. There's no TV. There's no cable news. You had a guy named Isaiah Montgomery who was ripped to shreds by Frederick Douglass for voting against black men being able to vote in 1890 in Mississippi. Even in the 1970s, you have Julian Bond calling out James Brown and Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, the kind of power that the Breakfast Club has and other outlets, they just seem to be misusing that power. And Michael Harriot said, I don't think it's intentional. I almost do think it's intentional.
Yeah.
I think it is intentional. Go ahead, brother.
This is where this is really key, and this is again why I love saying you. Some of this stuff is about access, some of this stuff is about fear, and some of this stuff is about a small pond. Let's be perfectly candid. You know there is a long history of black folk going at each other. Sometimes playfully we call it the dozens. But because of the contraction that we've seen and the transformation of media, and the fact that it's more and more about building your own particular audience and brand because networks are changing and websites are contracting and radio is in different kinds of places, there are people who are afraid to call out other media outlets in ways that we might have done even 15 or 20 years ago. And the fact of the matter is, and Michael and I can agree and disagree on this, right? That's why I liked having him on the show, right? Michael himself said, look, some of this is about ego. Some of these hosts have to recognize that you don't have the capacity to hold Nikki Haley accountable in real time. You can watch Nikki Haley on TV and be like, oh my gosh, she's lying. But she is a skilled politician. So you need to have a skill set to go head to head with her on the air, or she's going to walk all over you. You can say that Candace Owens is ridiculous, but you got to have a skill set to go head to head with her. Roland Martin once had on Richard Spencer. Okay.
I remember this.
Yeah. You have to be skilled to have a white nationalist on your show and counter him, because that man is prepared to go into a black space and sound reasonable and sound kind, and then walk out and say, look what I did to those colored people. Look at how well I came across. So some of this is the ego on the part of some of these hosts. And some of this, and I want to be really, really clear about this, because Michael mentioned it again, listen to my podcast, blah, blah. I think you guys would really love this discussion, because some of this is also about the arrogance of people who want to get into politics and dabble and not be held accountable. So I'm going to say this, Clay, because I've talked about it in news public. Killer Mike was critical of me because I was talking about him on MSNBC. But the fact of the matter is, if Killer Mike wants to discuss politics, then Killer Mike has to be prepared for other people in politics to say, hey, I think you're wrong, or I think the things you're representing are wrong. And he didn't really want to hear that. And he was critical of me online. Right? The same thing with Charlemagne the God. Look, if you want to dabble in politics, then you have to accept that other people are going to be critical of you. So when Dr. Christina Greer says, hey, maybe you should read a book before you let Nikki Haley walk all over you, what was his response? He called her the donkey of the day the day. Let's be real about this. If you're going to get into this game, then you have to accept that other people are going to criticize you. And let's also be clear about the way in which people like Joe Budden or Killer Mike or Charlemagne the God respond differently depending on if the critic is a man or a woman. Because there's a gendered way that these people respond to criticism as well. I am perfectly happy, and I mentioned it on the show, that Charlemagne in particular, right, that, a week after having on Candace Owens, he had on Mayor Eric Adams and Ole Olamuri, and Ole was amazing. She ethered him. It was fantastic. And I think
it was amazing.
Great. Yeah, I've had her on my podcast before.
She's a goddess.
Talking about, right. She is
intellectual goddess.
Yes, she is fantastic. You could play the ether beat over that whole conversation, right? And that was an example of using that platform and Charlemagne and his staff stepping back and saying, you know what? We've let Eric Adams come on our program who knows how many times and spout whatever he spouted.
Who is a Democrat? Who is a Democrat, mind you?
Who is a Democrat?
You still got to hold him accountable. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. We've let this Democratic mayor come on our air tons of times and spout things and not hold them accountable. Let's put somebody in here who's qualified to do this. So again, the platforms can be used for good. But if you're going to dabble in this stuff, you've got to be willing to take criticism. You can't just attack people and get mad and call them names because they don't like what you're doing. And here's the thing. This ain't just about Charlemagne. It happens to you, Clay. It happens to me. It happens to any of us who work in these public space. It happens to Joy. It happens to Roland. If you're going to get in this arena, you're going to take some hits.
That's right.
But if you care about what you're talking about, you don't go and complain and snitch on people and yell. There's so many things I can't say on the air, but I'm gonna tell you afterwards about how some of these people behave when they have been called out for how poorly they have managed their platforms when it comes to politics. And that was sort of a larger point of what me and Michael are talking about. And the danger of this, going back to what you were saying, Clay, is it is an access issue. Because we do all need each other. There is somebody out there right now who may have really disagreed with something that Clay Kane said a week ago, but it's like, damn, but I got a book I want to promote. I can't say this about Clay Kane because he may not let me on his show. But you know what I think? I think Clay Kane has enough integrity as a radio host and as a journalist and as an intellectual that if somebody had a legitimate beef with you and still had a book they wanted to promote, you'd let them on.
Absolutely. I've done that.
But you ain't like everybody else, Clay. There's a lot of folks out there that don't want to do that. They want to dip their toes in politics. And if they get their toe bit, now they want to cancel people. Now they don't want to talk to that person anymore. And that's what we have to battle against because we are in a war with a shrinking pool of media access for a lot of us. Not everybody is going to survive creating their own YouTube channel like Roland Martin, creating their own YouTube channel like Mark Lamont Hill. We're going to have voices that are increasingly dependent on each other. And if we can't hold each other accountable, if we can't criticize each other, if we can't say to Joe Budden, yo, Joe, I like your show in this area and in that area, but you let Candace Owens go and that's not cute. That's not just being open-minded. That's actually dangerous. If you can't say to Charlemagne the God, hey, Charlemagne, look, I like what you did with Eric Adams and Ole, but I think what you did with Candace Owens was dangerous. I think what you used to do a couple of years ago with Tommy Lauren was dangerous. I think that you need to hold Democrats and Republicans equally accountable. I think sometimes when you spread misinformation, it's okay for people to say, hey, I like your show about this, but I don't like it on that. If we can't create that kind of humility amongst those of us who are important speakers and voices in Black media, then our people are doomed.
You know, you bring up it being gendered. What I find so interesting is that Charlemagne was harsher on Monique than he was on Candace Owens.
There you go.
He was hard as hell on Monique, who is not a politician,
nope,
who is a comedian, who is asking for equity from a streaming service.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so hard on her, yet he treated Candace Owens like just a pass. It's so unfortunate. And she would never sit down with you or I. She would never sit down. Roland Martin keeps inviting her on. She would never sit down with Roland Martin. At this point, I don't even think I would sit down with Candace. It would just be 2 hours of fact checking. It's like talking to a flat earther. Yeah. You know, but it's unfortunate. And I'll say this too. I know some folks may get upset that I'm saying this, but I got to say this. You know, one of the insidious things that Candace Owens did, remember that photo of Andrew Gillum naked, passed out on a floor in a Miami hotel room? Allegedly, she was part of making that photo go viral.
Mm-hmm.
Really, if that would have happened to a woman, Democrat or Republican, folks would have denounced that
Yeah.
immediately. And, Andrew Gillum is a part of the Native Land podcast with Tiffany Cross and Angela Rye.
Mm-hmm.
And damn, I was just hoping, this is somebody who's on your team. I was just hoping that you would have called her out for the way that she attacked a black man.
Yes.
That was disgusting for her to do.
That's
If someone did that
crew.
to Candace, part of your crew, if someone did that to Candace Owens, if she was naked on the floor unconscious, I would say that's vile. You don't do that to somebody. And spreading that photo and media outlets attach themselves to it. I mean, maybe that's a part of your crew. I just said, damn.
Yeah. Yeah. Funny how this is what I'm talking about, Clay, that like some of this accountability is, if you want to play in these spaces, people can call you out for this. Now, I don't know Andrew, right? I know other people on Native Land. Obviously, Tiffany Cross is a dear friend, right? But I mean, like, this is what I'm talking about. We're dealing also with these issues of access and propriety and everything else like that. I don't know how Andrew Gillum felt about that, but he is on a vertical that Charlemagne kind of runs. So how much freedom would he have to say anything, right? That's the other thing we're talking about. How much freedom do we have to say what we want to say, depending on where we are and who we work for? And while that's not new, right? If we want to have a default belief that everybody involved, that Joe Budden and Stephen A. Smith and Charlemagne the God and Umar Johnson and Karen Hunter and Clay Kane and Larry Favors and Jason Johnson, if we believe at the default, which I do, that every single one of those people kind of wants to see black folk do better, we may have different ways, but I assume everybody on that list, and more want to see black people do better, then part of that has to be protecting and defending each other from those who would do us harm, which goes back to what Michael Harriot was talking about. He's like, you shouldn't platform these people. These people cause harm. So it's not just that Candace Owens attacks the legacy of Breonna Taylor. It's not just that Candace Owens attacks the legacy of George Floyd. It's not just that Candace Owens has said vile, dishonest things about black people. If we can't defend somebody in our own team from her when she walks into the building, then what are we doing?
What are we doing?
And
that's part of the reason why I wrote The Grift, and I'm screaming from the mountaintop that these people are dangerous, and they infiltrate black spaces. They're a contagion. They don't just happen in a little vacuum. They infiltrate these spaces. When I had Omarosa on this show during her book tour, I held her accountable. Right. Now, she cussed me out, said I had a Jerry curl. And normally when you hold these hustlers accountable, they implode.
Yes.
And the best disinfectant is sunlight.
The best disinfectant. And here's the other thing. Because Michael and I talked about this. He said, look, I put Stephen A. in a different category because to him, he's like, hey, Stephen A. is a Republican. Well, we know Stephen A. is a Republican, but he still needs to be held accountable. Just like Eric Adams is a Democrat. He still needs to be held accountable. I don't care what party you're in. Right? You have to hold these people accountable. I don't care if your guest is Stacey Abrams or Murley Evers. Now, I can't see anything wrong with either of them. But I mean, like, you gotta be willing to hold people accountable. Otherwise, stay out the kitchen, right? If you ain't trying to box, if your arms aren't long enough to box with your guests, then put your gloves down and stick to sports or stick to music or stick to gossip, right? And it's not enough. I think this is so important, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. It's not enough to just have responses in the comments, because we're always going to have that. You post anything online, and people are going to respond in the comments. It's got to be from other peers. It's got to be other peers being backed up. It's got to be other peers in the industry saying, hey, pulling people aside publicly or privately and saying, this ain't right. This ain't how it's supposed to go, right? You might want to be careful the next time you had this person on. Did you know? I can't tell you, Clay, how many times I've done an interview and had women that I respect call me afterwards and say, hey, Jason, you missed this whole area because you didn't have enough of a gendered analysis. And I'm like, oh my gosh, hey, thanks for telling me. So I talk to those people the next time I go on because I want to make sure. I've had conversations where it's like my queer friends will be like, yo, I heard you have on this person. you should ask this or be in this particular area, because that's called taking responsibility for the platform that you have. And we can't play these games where I want to be the cool kid and I want to be friends with him. We ain't all got to be friends. J. Cole, Kendrick, and and Drake, they ain't got to be friends. They respect each other. They all go to a concert tour together one day, right? So we should be able to operate that same way in media. But those who don't want to, those who want to play and then take their ball and go when someone has a criticism of them, they're not helping the culture. They're not helping the people. And here's the thing, Clay. Not everybody is about helping the people. I mean, we got to be honest about that. Some people are just in this for clicks. Some people are just in this for the attention, right? But if you are just in it for the attention, if you're just in it for the clicks, then we have all the more reason to be critical of it.